really needed to start doing human studies. We needed to start studying microbiome in humans. And because we were studying diet, we knew that this was something we could go in and do right away. We didn't have to apply for FDA approval for a drug before we could do a human study. We could just start doing human dietary interventions, longitudinally monitoring the immune system and the microbiome, and starting to put the pieces together of what is it in diet that can change our microbiome in a healthy way, help us define what a healthy microbiome is, and monitor the immune system in great detail. And so there were really two critical components of this in addition to our microbiome expertise. One was Christopher Gardner's group. We wanted to do these human studies, but we're absolutely terrified of humans. We work with mice. Humans are terrifying in many ways.
But they house themselves. You don't have to pay. You don't have to pay for their housing.
That's true. Yeah.
For those that can afford housing, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Sadly, just for that portion of the population. So Christopher's group are masters at working with human populations. And then the other wonderful thing that we have at Stanford is this Human Immune Monitoring Center run by Mark Davis and Holden Maker. They started this beautiful center for allowing people to do immunology in humans. Critical element because a lot of the mouse studies don't translate well to humans. So if you can do the studies in humans, similar to how we were thinking about the microbiome, you learn something that you know is relevant to humans. And so having that immune profiling capability where we can monitor, hundreds to thousands of different parameters in the immune system longitudinally in people from a blood draw, and not just know if CRP goes up or if interleukin-6 goes up or down, but to be able to see all these facets of the immune system change in concert as we're changing the microbiome with diet was really a key component of this. And so our flagship study, supported by wonderful donors, so this actually isn't funded by typical foundations and national institutes of health. It was funded by philanthropy. We wanted to understand if we put people on a high fiber diet, how would that affect their microbiome and immune system? And if we put them on a high fermented food diet, a diet rich in live microbes and all the metabolites that are present from fermentation in foods, how would that change microbiome and immune system?
Could you give us some examples of what those diets look like? And were you changing their basal diet, or were you just adding things on top of what they were already eating?
So,
because it's hard to change people's diets.
It's very hard.
You have to trust that they actually do it and they're not sneaking and
totally. Yeah. And so we, we've started the Center for Human Microbiome Studies at Stanford for doing a lot of these studies. And a portion of the studies we do focus on supplements, probiotics, microbes delivered in pill form, prebiotics, which are purified forms of fiber. And in those cases, we actually can have placebo groups because, it's more like a drug study. And we don't change people's diets, so we can just administer this on top of what they're doing. So in a way, they're a lot more controlled, but it's not food. When you start doing food studies, you can't do a placebo group because people know what they're eating. And the other problem is that it's really hard to just change one thing, because as soon as you start adding something, people usually eliminate something else. So the idea was to basically give these people simple instructions for, in the case of the high fiber diet, just increasing plant-based fiber. So can you eat more whole grains, more legumes, more vegetables, nuts, get the fiber up in the range of, from 15 to 20 grams per day up to over 40 grams per day. So can you kind of double or more the amount of fiber that you eat per day, knowing that that would have a tremendous impact on a lot of other facets of their diet. They eat less meat, animal-based protein, less animal-based fats as a product of this. I will say that getting back to the, Christopher's rule for a healthy diet, a lot of the macronutrient changes that we saw in their diet were consistent with healthy changes in diet, less saturated fat, less animal-based protein, more plant-based protein. So a lot of changes that are known to be beneficial kind of came in concert with just telling people eat a high fiber diet, high plant-based fiber diet. The people that were eating the high fermented food diet, they were instructed to basically eat foods that you could buy at a grocery store that were naturally fermented and contain live microbes. And so this, largely consisted of yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, some fermented vegetables, kind of brine fermented vegetables, pickles, things like that. But they do, one of the things that I think is a pitfall in choosing fermented foods is, you can go down the canned food aisle and there's this huge section of pickles and jars that are canned. Those are not fermented foods. Those are cucumbers that they've put in acetic acid and vinegar to reconstitute that fermented flavor, but there's no live microbes involved in that. And even sauerkrauts in the canned food aisle, even if they were naturally fermented, quite often they're not. Quite often they're just brined in vinegar. But even if they are naturally fermented, all of the microbes are killed prior to canning or during the process of canning. And so so what we use for this study, and if you want to have live fermented foods that contain live microbes, you need to buy those out of the refrigerated section, essentially.
And I'm really glad you pointed this out because you can find sauerkraut on the non-refrigerated shelf. That is indeed non-fermented. A lot of fermented foods that are available in the U.S. Can be high in sugar. So was there any instruction as to, getting people to make sure that they were consuming yogurts that weren't loaded with sugar?
Yep.
Or did you let them just select for the stuff in the cold section that is fermented?
No, it's a super important point. We instructed people to eat non-sweetened yogurts. Right. I think a huge pitfall in this area is you can have a yogurt loaded with bacteria, kind of the base of what's healthy, and then a ton of artificial flavoring and sugar loaded on top of that. Manufacturers put a ton of sugar in after the fact to kind of mask the sour taste of fermented foods, which is hard for some people to become accustomed to. When we were switching to more fermented foods, our daughters were young at that point, we would take, plain yogurt, which they didn't like, just kind of neat. We would mix in a little maple syrup or honey, just a little bit. And gradually we reduced that over time to the point where their palate adjusted and now they just really like plain yogurt. But it is, I think getting used to that sour flavor is difficult, but people really should try to stay away from those fermented foods that are loaded with sugar. And that's what we instructed people in this study.
And beer was not included, right?
Beer,
the number of people that asked when I did a brief thing on social media about this study, and hopefully I got it right. I think I did. But people just ask about beer. I'm not a drinker, so for me, beer has no appeal anyway. But beer is fermented, correct? But were they instructed to avoid beer or to drink beer?
Just to go with their normal dietary habits, but that did not count as a fermented food. And
but kombucha was, as I recall.
Kombucha was,
right? Yeah.
And kombucha can have small amounts of alcohol in it. Kombucha actually was one of the major things that people drank consumed during the fermented food phase. And the deal with beer is that there may be beneficial properties of the microbial communities in naturally fermented beer, but most of the beer that we buy, again, is canned and filtered, and there's no live microbes there. So very different than if you siphon it off of your home brew and drink it, probably, than if you buy it in a store.
I will get to the results of the study in just one moment, but I want to say a lot of people shy away from the high quality fermented foods because they can be quite costly. I'll just refer people to a resource in Tim Ferriss's book, The 4-Hour Chef. He actually gives an excellent recipe for making your own sauerkraut, which basically involves cabbage and water and salt, but you have to do it properly because you can grow some not necessarily lethal, but some somewhat dangerous bacteria if you don't scrape off the top layer properly. But he gives beautiful instructions for how to do this in vats. We've started doing this at home now, actually, as we get which is a ceramic vat. And you can make large amounts of truly fermented sauerkraut just from cabbage, water, and salt if you're willing to follow the protocol. And if you're interested in science, that protocol looks a lot like what you'll do for most of your graduate career, except maybe some sequencing too. Right. So anyway, just to refer people to a source that's very low cost compared to buying the high quality fermented foods. Even kombuchas, for some people, it's like $5 a bottle, and only this much. And if you consume liquids the way I consume them, that's kind of just the start. So
but if you can get your hands on a SCOBY, kombucha is another one that's super simple. It's
you can grow your own.
You can just make your own, and it's super easy to do. I constantly have a batch of kombucha going at home, and it's just it's a SCOBY, a symbiotic community of bacteria and yeast that you brew tea, you add sugar to it, and you put the SCOBY in, and you wait a week or two, depending upon the temperature, and you just move the SCOBY over to a new batch, and what the SCOBY was in is kombucha, and it's wonderful.
I love it. I would love it if members of this audience would start to make their own kombucha and sauerkraut. I've been having so much fun. Well, I don't do it, but it's done in our home. I don't go anywhere near the food production, and it's for everyone's benefit. So how much fermented food, and then were they consuming? And because you mentioned the number of grams approximately of fiber, and but was it in servings, ounces? How many times a day? Early day, late day?
Right. Yeah. So we had a wonderful dietitian instructing people for this, and her name's Dahlia Perlman, and she really was the key and is the key for many of our studies for getting people to eat differently. And the general instructions were for people to eat as much fermented foods as possible. More is better. And the reason is that with this initial study, we really wanted to maximize our chance of seeing a signal if there was something biological going on, with the idea that if the dose was excessive and not easily achievable by a lot of people in the end, we can go back and say, okay, this is the point at which we lose the biological signal. But people during the height of the intervention phase was 6 weeks. During the height of that, we're up over 6 servings on average per day of fermented foods. So kind of 2 servings at each meal. And the ounces or weight or size, it really depended on what the fermented food was. And we just told them to stick to what was a recommended dose on the package that they were buying. For kombucha, it'd be like a 6 to 8 ounce glass, sauerkraut like a half cup or something like that, and the same with yogurt.
Great. So what were the results?
Yeah, so the results astounded us in a way, but then thinking more deeply, and it'll be evident even after I explain it in the context of this conversation, likely why we saw the results we saw. The results were astounding because our hypothesis going into this was that the high fiber diet was going to give the massive signal. We know that this is the big deficiency in the Western diet. All the mouse studies have told us that high fiber really leads to a much healthier microbiota, can lead to positive changes in the immune system. And in fact, even when we had we had wonderful donor support, but still a limited amount of money. When we started this study, my lab was really very eager to do the high fiber part of this really well. And Christopher kind of had to twist our arms to do the fermented food side of it. And we thought it was kind of quirky and neat, like live microbes should be exciting, like let's try it. So we put that in, and it turns out that we were very thankful that he twisted our arms, because it was that high fermented food arm that really gave us the big signal. Even though our hypothesis was that the high fiber was going to lead to more short chain fatty acids produced in the gut, more diverse microbiota, less inflammation in the immune system, we didn't see that across the cohort. We actually saw very individualized responses to the dietary fiber, and I'll come back to what those responses were. The big signal really was in the fermented food group. We saw all the things that you would hope to see in a Western microbiota and Western human. We saw this increase in microbiota diversity over the course of the 6 weeks while they were consuming the fermented foods. And we can't always say that higher diversity is better when it comes to our microbial communities. We know there are cases, for instance, bacterial vaginosis, where higher diversity is actually indicative of a disease state. But we know in the context of the gut and for people living in the industrialized world, higher diversity is generally better. We know that there's a spectrum of diversity. People with higher diversity generally are healthier. If you can push your diversity higher, you're in better shape. And so we saw that increase in diversity. And then the major question is what happened to the immune system as these people were increasing their gut microbiota diversity through the fermented foods. We did this massive immune profiling, and we see, a couple dozen immune markers, inflammatory markers, decrease over the course of the study. So we measure these at multiple time points throughout the course of the study, and there's kind of this stepwise reduction in things like interleukin-6 and interleukin-12, a variety of kind of famous inflammatory mediators. And then even if you go into the immune cells and you start looking at their signaling cascades, we see that those signaling cascades are less activated at the end of the study compared to the beginning of the study, indicating an attenuation of inflammation. So kind of exactly what we would hypothesize would lead to less propensity for inflammatory disease over time. That's a huge extension of a very short study.
How long was this study again?
So the complete protocol, I think, was 14 to 17 weeks or something like that. The actual intervention phase consisted of a 4-week ramp and then a 6-week maintenance period. So the intervention itself was 10 weeks, but there were 6 weeks of really kind of hardcore high levels of fiber or fermented foods.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the ramp, because my experience with fermented foods is that it can be beneficial to give the system an opportunity to acclimate. I mean, if you consume a giant bowl of sauerkraut, it's not going to be the worst day and night of your life, but you'll know you did.
Totally.
We'll just leave it at that. And so you want to kind of acclimate to it. I'm at the point now where some people might think this is gross, but after I exercise, I've been sweating a lot. I like the saltiness of I actually drink the liquid that the sauerkraut has been stewing in, and I like to think that I consume some fermentation that way. It's salty. It acts as kind of a post-training replenishment. But if I had done that 6 months ago straight off, I think it would have been pretty rough on my system. I started taking little bits of it and then adding it each day.
Totally. And so both with the fermented foods and the fiber, it's well known that this kind of gradual ramping is a really important way of mitigating bloating and other kind of digestive discomfort that can happen when your microbiome reconfigures and starts fermenting more and changing community members. So you should take that ramp at your own pace. If something seems to be going wrong, just kind of level off, stay there. We did this in a very delicate way to get people up to the high dose. The brine question, just a tangent here for a second, that was actually one of the products that we had people used in the fermented food phase. There's actually a product called Gut Shots, which is just the brine from that they've marketed. We actually are now studying it in the lab. I just actually, before this, came from a lab meeting where a GI fellow in my lab is actually putting Gut Shots, sterilized gut microbes, or the fermented fermentation microbes removed or present into mice, and looking at changes in their mucosal immune system. So we're studying this in detail now because it's a rich source of lactate and a bunch of other interesting metabolites.